Please give a warm welcome to Lila Neugebauer. Thanks for being here, Lila.
Oh, thanks for having me.
When I introduced a film, I told them about that this film is all about subtext. It's all set in the present, and we find out about things that happened in the past, but it's through watching the actors, living with the subtext, Can you tell us about that approach in the filmmaking, and how was it difficult, et cetera? Yeah.
Sure. Hi. Hi. First, just thank you all so much for choosing to spend your Saturday morning with this movie and sticking around to talk with me. Really, really appreciate it. I've never been to Santa Barbara, I'm embarrassed to say. And I really wish I was staying longer. Oh my God,
you're gonna have
so
to come
beautiful.
back.
Please, please. So anyway, it's very nice to be here. The present tense. Well, what I can confide in you is that we shot flashbacks. There was a whole storyline that was set in Afghanistan. And my incredible production designer, Jack Fisk, who's really a living legend in his own right, transformed a landfill in New Orleans, Louisiana, into an army base. It was incredible. Incredible is really a grotesque understatement. It was like an achievement of wonders. The photography was visually arresting. The production design was incredible. The performances were wonderful. I loved that photography. We shot it on 16 millimeter. You read and hear a lot about killing your darlings, and then you kind of got to live it. And that was painful, actually, to cut that photography. I loved it. But in the editorial process, it became very apparent to me that the strongest version of this film was set exclusively in the present. That was for a number of reasons. To distill, I would say, in part, it became apparent to me that on very simple terms, the focus of the film is really not what happened before, which isn't to say it doesn't matter. It matters deeply for both of these characters. But the focus is really how to cope with what happened, how to live with it and live through it. And I think what I found, so I felt that on a kind of macro level in terms of the film's concerns. And then as I was dealing with that editorially scene by scene, my feeling was that every time I cut away, look at this adorable dog. Sorry,
That's
so
her.
well behaved.
That's
Hi,
Sophia.
Honey. Oh my God, you're
She
amazing.
actually likes
you're
the
so
film.
cozy. I feel that. Did you? I would love to know your thoughts. We'll discuss it later. The end of that monologue is simply that every time I cut away from their performances, I felt like I was robbing them and the viewer of the ability to stay present and stay connected. And I found that when you cast actors who have such extraordinary depth of inner life, who are revealing to you the processing of that experience in what I found to be such a compelling way, to disrupt that, to splinter it, it did not feel in keeping with what was actually happening on screen that was so strong. And I wanted to respect that and honor it.
The scenes with Gloria, the mother, and Lindsay, there is so much backstory that we never hear about, but that we feel. And you talk about the Afghanistan flashbacks, but there were no flashbacks on the mother-daughter relationship, but they're present. Tell us about those scenes, which are so powerful between the mother and daughter.
I'm so glad that was your experience. This is another moment in which I want to credit the actors.
Linda
Emond, yeah, and Jen, of course. I think when you are crafting what are fundamentally very suggestive scenes, in which so much of what really matters is happening underneath the language or between the language, between the words, often the task is to draw a kind of rich collection of inferences and extrapolations that can inform those spaces in between, so that ideally you are still holding a great deal of emotional information in that space, even when the text contains very little exposition. I think if that was happening for you, which I'm glad to hear it was, I credit the kind of richness of internal life that the two of them each created, and the kind of shared conversation we were able to build, so that we knew what we were holding, even if the characters in the moment were not speaking to it.
But that's something that you encouraged, did that correct? And when I introduced the film, I mentioned that you're theater royalty, and then you made a choice of casting, Linda Emmon and Stephen, and just theater actors, Jane as well. Jane, how do you put?
Howdy Shell.
Howdy Shell.
Yeah, who plays Sharon.
Sharon at the beginning of the film. These are all theater actors, and they're surrounding, cocooning Jennifer and Brian. Tell us about that choice that you made.
One of the great joys of showing up to set, I mean, there were many, but as this is my first film, was to feel so at home, because I had every single member of the supporting cast in this film is someone I knew from the New York theater community, who I'd either worked with on a play or in a workshop of a play, or who I'd seen in plays Broadway and off-Broadway. So that kind of feeling of shared culture, creative culture, I think created a kind of shorthand. And it also just felt like a fabulous opportunity to kind of bring the New York stage to New Orleans and to this world. So that was just immensely gratifying. And likewise, I think, I'm dittoing what you were noting before, with the exception of maybe the doctor scenes, because every kind of clinical scene, in the way that it functions procedurally, as they do in life, has to grapple with information. Presumably that's what we go to a doctor for, information, in part. But otherwise, and of course what's really going on in that scene has less to do with the information, but anyway, a power struggle. That's a different story. But I would say, I think overall, theater actors have such an ingrained practice of building a very deep musculature based on a kind of robust building out of given circumstances. And in part that's because when you do a play, you have to kind of build up an architecture for yourself, so that when the director goes away, you can carry the whole story, in one take. And I suspect that that kind of reference point may have been helpful in a film that is often somewhat spare on dialogue, but hopefully rich in lived experience.
You mentioned New Orleans. New Orleans is another character in the film, and it's not a New Orleans that we've seen in the past, where it's vibrant and exciting, and then there's Bourbon Street and things that we recognize. Instead, it's like this private world, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I felt that with Lindsay, the Jennifer Lawrence character, she feels trapped in this world, and there's a dichotomy happening with the New Orleans that we feel, we know, and her New Orleans. Can you talk about that approach?
Likewise, I'm so glad that was your experience. New Orleans, I don't know if people in this room have spent time there. You're nodding. It's what an incredible American city. A lot of American cities are like other American cities. There's nothing like New Orleans. It is a place of such singularly rich cultural tradition. Those people have also been through a lot. That's a city with its fair share of collective trauma, and they are a very resilient population, and their pride of place is infectious. I mean, there's also a lot I could say about how gracious they were as hosts. A lot of our crew was local. They took care of us. And the people opened their streets and their homes to us. I mean, they were incredible hosts when we shot this movie. Every frame you saw is shot in New Orleans. But vis-a-vis the portrayal of it that you're describing, it is, I'm dittoing what you said, it is a city which is most sort of popularly identified by way of its tourist spots, Bourbon Street, great place to get a drink. And it's, celebrations, Mardi Gras, also a very good time. But first, it felt important to me to try to craft a portrait of this city that felt much more intimate, that felt like it belonged to the residents, the private spaces. And likewise, dittoing also what you said, our protagonist does not feel at home in her home. It's not a vibrant, dynamic place for her, even though it is a vibrant, dynamic place. So I think we both wanted to honor the place with authenticity and credibility, and also, try to capture what it felt like to her.
And then I mentioned to you outside that I was so captivated with the sound landscape of the film. Normally, the soundtrack, we think New Orleans, we're going to hear jazz and fun music. Instead, it's very minimalist, the soundtrack. And then you add this layer of sound. We hear cicadas. We hear the wind blowing. The last scene, I was blown away by the fact that we hear the wind blowing in the silence, the pauses between the two of them. Can you talk about that, creating that soundscape?
I will say that, so in addition to being a culturally rich place, I mean, music is culture, New Orleans, as you said, has an incredibly divergent, varied, deep, rich musical tradition. Jazz, soul, bounce. And I will acknowledge that my amazing composer, Alex Summers, and I, we talked about that. Like, should we use brass? But as I was also just saying, Lindsay does not feel at home there. And we felt that the score should express her soul. So we went in a different direction with that. But having made that choice, it was incredibly important to me to feel the place. And so I worked with our amazing music supervisor, a woman named Susan Jacobs, to try to load up the cracks of the films diegetically with as sort of varied a palette. The drive-bys, what's playing in the bodega, the corner store when you pass, what's at the auto repair shop, to try to feel the sonic textures musically that way. And then likewise, diegetically, man, it's a humid place. And so to try to feel the atmosphere by way of the cicadas, the streetcars, the little lonely whistle of a passing train. And a lot of that's actually, some of it's practical. There were a lot of cicadas that night with that kiddie pool outside with her mom, and there were some crazy toads in the night we shot at that pool. The toads are louder than they are. I mean, that took some magic of sound mixing to hear them talking over the toads. But a lot of it is also crafted by my amazing mixers, Skip Leavesay and Chris Che.
Let's talk about the character of James and Brian, who is amazing in it. I love this character because he's almost wearing two phases. It's like there's the public phase that he's so warm and welcoming to everybody, but then we totally understand from the get-go that there's this internal hurt and damage in him. Tell us about the character, and then, of course, casting Brian and working with him, who you went to school with.
I did, yeah. So, I've known Brian since I was 19. I was in college, in undergrad, when he was in drama
Yale.
School. That's true. So I feel like I've been in on The Secret for a long time. It's not really much of a secret anymore. I don't know if people watch Atlanta. That's how a lot of people now know Brian's work, this great TV show, Atlanta. But I think he can do anything. And I think he is an actor of such kind of astonishing depth of spirit, magnetism. I mean, you just look into those eyeballs, and I feel like a universe of experience and meaning is made available to you. He's he will make himself so exposed to the camera in a way that I find so beautiful and painful. And I mean, I feel like it's really a cliche that we talk about honesty in performances. It's sort of an overused cliche, but I do feel like Brian's not really capable of a dishonest moment in performance. He's connected to something very truthful in himself. So when I read the script, he was the first person I wanted to cast, and really the only person. I didn't want anyone else to play this part, and I felt immensely grateful and honored that Brian wanted to be a part of my first movie. With regard to your observations about the character, which I also loved, I too, it's funny, I think of James also as someone who, who like I think to his neighbors and his coworkers and the regulars at the bar that he drinks at, like, I think they probably know he's been through something horrific, but they think like, he's done a pretty good job coming back. Like, he's affable, knows how to make easy conversation with people from different walks of life, funny, charming, seemingly available. But I think he's in grief for his life, and would never want to make that anyone else's problem, which is where I think that kind of mask comes in. I think he wouldn't want to burden anyone with it. But I think, like Lindsay, is immensely isolated and deeply, deeply in need of connection and intimacy.
Which leads me to the brother. The brother is hovering through the entire film, and then we actually see him. Tell us about including the brother into the narrative.
Sure. I likewise am so glad you felt his absence as a presence.
You're making me feel very smart.
Well, no, I'm just enjoying I'm like, you're making me feel great about what we conveyed. I will also share with you that scene was not in the original screenplay that I read for this film.
So
the scene was not. The character existed, but we never met him. He was gone and on the road, and he was not actually in jail. We made that decision. But the character existed, and his absence was a very important element in that first script that I read. And I think as we started to develop it, it became apparent that encounter could be a very fruitful and revelatory one for Lindsay, and that as the kind of potential for a kind of revelation and reckoning for her, that could make for a good scene and a pivotal scene ultimately, which I think we also discovered upon shooting it.
And then was it always in the script to be a deaf actor? And you cast Russell Harvard in the film. Tell us about that.
No, it was not written for a deaf actor. But I like Jane and Linda and Steven and even like Neil, the neuropsych, Danny Wallahan, who pushes the wheelchair, Fred Weller, the pool guy, all New York theater people. I had seen Russell Harvard in a couple of plays in New York, and I thought, that guy's a movie star. I mean, I think he is a movie star. I think he's unbelievable. And I wanted to cast Russell.
Which adds a layer then. Here I'm geeking out. I love the fact that he's deaf, the character, and the whole film is about what's underneath and what we can't, what things are not spoken about, but it's underneath, and it's so powerful to have him be the brother. Jennifer, when I introduced the film, it's like this is the way that Jennifer started. We knew her as this independent film actress. She was stripped down and just so grounded. And you've brought her back to that level of stripped down Jennifer Lawrence. Tell us about working with her and how did it come about, your relationship?
Sure. Only about 6 weeks, so this is the sort of origin story, but then I'm happy to talk about her performance at great length, or briefly, depending on what everyone wants to talk about. About 6 weeks after I read this script and attached myself to it, I heard that Jen had read it. and as I had a very strong reaction to it. And somebody said, "Would you like to have dinner with her?" And I said, "Sure." So we had dinner, and were connected very deeply quickly, and were very aligned creatively and aesthetically. And I think both felt from that first encounter a strong instinct that we would have a very fruitful creative partnership. She's also a producer on this film. So that collaboration on this project has been ongoing in every aspect. And has been so endlessly fruitful and honestly joyful. She's just a remarkable co-pilot in every way, and very protective of the director, actually. I think she really sees her role as a producer as that her job is to protect the filmmaker. Which, as a first-time filmmaker, I sort of didn't know that might be a producer's job, and it's pretty incredible to have your producer think that's their job, to be your advocate. I too feel connections in this performance to the earliest work of hers I was exposed to, which was Winter's Bone. And I guess what strikes me, I mean, she's a woman of great range. What I continue to be very struck by in this particular register for her is that there is such a raw depth of feeling that can be conveyed in such a subtle and understated register, such a restrained register, and which I think requires tremendous discipline.
There is so much care on the veteran aspect and the rehab and the medical aspect of the film, although you don't go super in depth, but it feels so grounded and authentic. How much research did you do on the film?
I'm so glad that you felt that also. While we were developing the script and during prep for the film, while shooting and deep into post, I was consulting very extensively with U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs medical professionals, so experts in the field of traumatic brain injury, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, neurologists, and also talking at great length with veterans and U.S. Armed Forces service members, many of whom had incurred TBIs, but also others who had not, who were just incredibly generous in their willingness to talk to me about their reasons for enlisting, their experiences while deployed, the challenges they faced returning home. These people opened their lives to me, and the film wouldn't exist without them. It simply would not. I also brought Jen into some of that research. We spent an unforgettable day at the VA in New York. It's called New York Harbor Health, talking with veterans and working with their OTs and PTs who equipped us with very key insights for Jen's physical work in the film. And then whenever we shot any of the rehabilitation photography, I had OTs and PTs from the New Orleans VA, where I also spent a lot of time talking with the neuro staff. The New Orleans VA is an incredible, the old VA was destroyed in Katrina, but the New Orleans VA now is this unbelievable state-of-the-art facility. It's one of the biggest and the best in the countries as far as VAs go. They were on set with us, so they'd be with me at the monitor, and then we'd jump in together and sort of craft a moment of physicality. And actually the nurses in the 2 moments in the physical therapy gym at the beginning of the film, those are real nurses from the New Orleans VA.
And have they seen the film, and what has been the reaction?
The staff at New Orleans VA, we're a part of the New Orleans Film Festival, so on November, soon. It's like in a couple of weeks, and I just asked for a big allotment, and I got 25 tickets. So I'm very excited because I can't wait to give them all to the people at the VA. I mean, who knows if they want to come, but I hope they want to come and see them, and also in the case of the ones who are in the film, see their own performances. I have shared the film with some of the veterans I've spoken to, and we had an incredible military advisor on this film who himself is a Marine and a real veteran advocate. The responses have been very moving, very moving. And, I think of various hopes one might have. For me, I think if anyone who has lived an experience like this sees this and sees even some small kernel of truth reflected back to them. I mean, that would be my wish, and my wish would be that that experience of recognition might in some small way be useful.
There's a timelessness to your film, and I know that the film is very specific about the Afghanistan war and vets from the Afghanistan war. But I couldn't help when I was watching the film that we've all gone through 2 years of collective trauma, and that it was speaking to that aspect. When you were making the film, were you thinking about the timelessness aspect of the film, or just the specificity of the trauma of the Afghanistan war?
Both. I mean, so both of the above. And what I guess I would say is, you know, I don't know, I'm saying oddly. I'm saying oddly because it doesn't matter if the film is actually set in 2014. There's no reason you would know that. It's set in 2014, frankly, because there were some details around what she was doing in Afghanistan when that photography existed. She's working on the Dala Dam that had to do with a project that I'd researched that was going on at that point. Although I'd also note that, of course, we withdrew from Afghanistan while we were making this film. Our production on this film was spread out over 3 years, which is its own pandemic-related story, but we began photography for this film in the summer of 2019, and were suspended due to a hurricane, and by the time we came back, and were able to assemble everyone back, it was March of 2020, and 24 hours before I got on a plane, I found out I was not getting on a plane. And then it took another 18 months to get everybody back together. COVID setbacks, a lot of things happened, but we completed photography for the film last summer, so 2 years later in 2021. And in the course of that time, America had withdrawn. So the film has become a period piece. I mean, who knows what the future holds? I should acknowledge that with regard to America's involvement there. That said, it is my feeling and my hope that the concerns of the film are enduring in a number of respects. In part, that so long as we have sent people to fight, they've come home changed. And we, as a country, have struggled to take care of them. That's always been true, and it continues to be true. In fact, it's a mental health crisis. So that's an enduring dilemma. That's an understatement, the word dilemma. And I think for anyone who is not a service member or a veteran, I suppose in light of what you said about recent events, I think, yes, for anyone who didn't already have a life in which they knew what isolation felt like, or disassociation, a disruption in terms of your relationship to your routines, your community, the way you connect with people, I imagine, yes, that experience is more widely known now.
Yeah, I think we all ultimately long for some form of connection, and you know, I've seen the ending of your film now a few times, and the need to connect in whichever way or to be heard is so essential to us, and it is ultimately timeless. I'm so glad you think so. Knowing your past achievements in theater, you're very theatrical, very stylized filmmaker. Not filmmaker. You know, theater director. I'm thinking, you know, The Wolves. I'm thinking your work with Tracy Letts and Kenneth Lonergan. But then I was stunned in a good way, the fact that your work in cinema is so realistic in your approach and subtle. Can you tell us about that dichotomy of the two approaches?
Sure. I think irrespective of the medium, this is going to sound a little bit cheesy, forgive me. I'm always interested in what a thing wants to be on its own terms. Meaning I'm reading a text or thinking about a character, and I'm asking myself, what is the most rigorous expression of how this particular character wants to manifest, or what is the most rigorous and appropriate expression of how this story wants to manifest. And so, which is to say that my work in the theater has been in a real range of stylistic registers, more hypernaturalistic, more surrealist or expressionistic, louder, quieter, smaller, bigger. And likewise, this is a very intimate film, and I would say an understated, restrained, patient film. But you know, I like a big, loud, fast-paced period piece too. I don't know if those things always go together, but anyway, depends on which period. In the case of this story, from my first encounter with, again, this original screenplay, which admittedly changed, but I perceived in it from the outset what felt to me like a deeply felt lyricism, a patience, a carefulness, and the opportunity for a quiet visual poetry. And I think many of my earliest conversations with my amazing DP, Diego Garcia, and with Jack, who I've mentioned, they centered around wanting to handle these characters with utmost sensitivity. We wanted to take care of these characters. And I think we all, in service of that, wanted to craft a kind of visual language and like a mise en scène that really privileged a careful attentiveness to characterization, which we didn't want to be overburdened by excesses in style. So we were interested in how what might appear to be a very simple frame could in fact contain a great deal of subjective emotional information, even if the frame was in fact quite simple and seemingly objective.
Yeah. Yeah, indulge me. I have a few of my students in the room. I always tell them that the subject matter, the content of the film, is what should dictate the way the film is put together, which is what you're basically reiterating, correct?
Yes. Would you like me to elaborate?
I'm sorry?
Yes, would you like me to elaborate? I'm like,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
exactly what I'm
loved
saying.
it.
I mean, since you say there are students in the room, I'll try to keep this brief, but whenever I've taught a little bit in New York in theater contexts, and there's this is about to get a little bit academic, I'm so sorry. But you said students in the room, so I'm like, all right, I'm going for it.
They're actually, all of them are students.
Well, I'm a student. I mean, this is my first movie. There's an essay that I like to give to students in all disciplines. I've taught actors and directors and writers, which is, of course, comical because I have no training in my own profession, but so I'm very humbled by that. Anyway, I always give this essay to read, which I read when I was in college, and it's called E.F.'s Visit to a Small Planet. The writer's a woman named Eleanor Fuchs. That's E.F. She's a dramaturg. And the proposition of the essay, it's about how to read a play. And the proposition of the essay is that when you read a play, the idea is hold the play out in front of you and imagine that it's a small planet. And you are invited to ask questions of the planet of the play. Questions like, how does time work on this planet? What is the climate of this planet? How is the social order organized on this planet? Questions like that. So you are investigating, like, how does this ecosystem operate on its own terms? And the proposition of this piece is to invite a different kind of critical lens that is so often people read plays exclusively through the lens of, let's say, psychological realism. So their questions have a lot to do with, like, well, why did that character do that thing? That doesn't seem like something somebody would do. But it's an invitation to look at a play through another lens and simply assume that everything is intentional and just essentially try to accept it for its own laws, structures, et cetera, before you then potentially take the step of drawing your own kind of subjective conclusions about what you think about that order.
Amazing. I cannot wait to see what you do next. I mean, theatrically, I will be there on the front row, but film-wise, yeah, we cannot wait to see what you do next.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for hanging out.